Hey kids, it's Professor von Agar, and today we're going to continue with our series of basic photography. I think it might be called guerrilla photography, the way I show you, but we're going to do a step up. This is a lecture and an idea of greater sophistication in development of your film and exposure of your film and development of your film. And I call this lecture Developing Your Film Wrong. But actually, the title should be Adjusting the Exposure and the Development of Your Film to Match the Contrast of Your Scene. That's what it should be titled. But that's too long and it's too boring. So I just call it Developing Your Film Wrong. So let's start with the basics. And for this, I'm going to go to the blackboard. So kids, here we are at our state-issued blackboard with state-issued chalk. If you recall from our previous lectures, we discussed the idea of finding a scene, using our light meter in our camera, exposing it, and developing the film normally. So if I can make a little diagram, I'll start off with just sort of a base, and this would be for a normal contrast subject, you know, like outdoors on a bright sunny day. And our focus with our earlier lectures was to have normal exposure and normal, how do you spell normal? Normal development. So that's sort of what we focused on. Now in our lecture today, we're going to do something different. If you think of this as a teeter-totter, and many of you have been on teeter-totters, if they still exist, you know that it can go this way or it can go this way. So in terms of exposure and development, if we were to give less exposure, then we would have to give more development. And that will give you a certain aesthetic effect that many photographers really like. Another possibility, if I can use the teeter-totter example again, is to give more exposure, but then because the teeter-totter is going down like that, you have to give less development. And that's it in a nutshell. That's what I'm going to discuss today. And here's how I sort of got into it. I'd like to show you an image by Edward Weston. You know, I was a kid and, 16, taking pictures, developing film normally, using the normal ASA. But then I started looking at the work of photographers who really inspired me. And one of those certainly was Edward Weston. And I remember seeing this picture taken at a deserted mine in the high Sierras. And the range of tonality from the interior and the toilet and the trash around the toilet going up to the glass, detail on the glass, detail outside on this bright sunny day amazed me. And I said, holy buckets, how did he do that? Another photographer who also inspired me was the work of a 35mm photographer, Henry Cartier-Bresson. He was well known in the 40s, 50s, and 60s as the great street photographer. And when he photographed, he was so busy doing commercial work that he didn't develop his own film, didn't make his own prints, but he had careful instructions on how to develop film, careful instructions on how to print. And one of the things, one of his little maxims was, in nature, there's no true black. I don't know if you believe in that, but in the print, when you look at his photographs, as in this scene from Old Jerusalem, and if you study the black robes of the men standing there in the shadows, they're filled with detail. And yet, you can see detail in the sunlit cobblestone street, the pavement. He had this wonderful, wide, expansive range, just like Edward Weston did with his scene from the old gold mine. So I wondered, how did he do that? And I did, at this point, do further explorations and studies. And one person who really informed me back then through books was the writings of Ansel Adams. Ansel Adams wrote a whole series, like a little encyclopedia, sort of an early version of Wikipedia, on photographic techniques. And he came out with a series of 5 books. Now, my father acquired these books early on because he studied with Ansel Adams. He studied with Minor White, who I'll talk about in a moment, back in 1950 at the California School of Fine Arts, just when I was born. So here I have the 5 books here. It's called Camera and Lens. It's a whole book on camera and the lens. Second book he published was The Negative, a whole book on how to develop film, different film developers, techniques, which we'll talk some of it today. The third book is on the print, and this one, really I read quite a bit. It's on burning and dodging and doing tricky things to your photographic print. This is all before RC now, so it's in the old world of real paper. And it was also in the world of graded paper. So polycontrast, multi-grade, all those papers came out in the 50s. So this is, a little bit before that. But anyway, so that's the print. That's also a great book. Here's a whole book on natural light photography, taking pictures outdoors with different filters, ideas for exposure and development and stuff like that. And then finally, because he had to make a buck back then, and he was a commercial photographer, he also did a whole book on artificial light. And this is before we have a lot of fancy flashes and strobes, and this is mainly fixed lighting. But it's also in the days where, remember, you did not have a digital camera, you could not review your image immediately, you did not have a histogram to look at, so you had to experiment, you had to do tests, and you build up a repertoire of understanding, and you apply that for your on-location photography. Then, another book that was very influential to me came out in about 1961, so I was about 11 years old. And this is by Minor White. Minor White was born and raised in St. Paul and went out to the West Coast to teach, and was teaching at the California School of Fine Arts when my dad was there. So Minor White then, in his Zone System Manual, talked about looking at the scene that you're going to take a picture of, looking at the different contrast levels between shadows and highlights, then developing your film, exposing your film and developing your film accordingly. So this book then became like my little miniature Bible that I went through ruthlessly to show you what I'm going to show you today. Now, the books of Ansel Adams no longer available, but you might be able to pick up a copy of a later revised book in the 1970s by John Schaefer. I'll show you that book. Here's your basic techniques of photography. Takes all 5 books and kind of incorporates it into this thickish volume. John Schaefer. So here are some of the basic principles, and these are for you to go beyond your basic guerrilla understanding of photography and to go to a more advanced level. You need to know some of these important principles in photography. And one is that your film, like Tri-X, can be exposed at different ASAs. So you're not locked into 400. You can rate your Tri-X at 200, at 100, even ASA 50. But you can also take your Tri-X and rate it at 800, 1600, and maybe more. You can re-rate your film, but if you do that, then you can't really develop it the same way. And here's our second principle, and that is film can be developed at times other than normal. A third principle is that exposure of film in the camera provides information that comes into the camera. If you give overexposure, letting more light into your camera, this is going to give you more information. So if you go from a Tri-X at 400 and go to 200, it's going to let in 1 stop more light, 1 stop more information in your shadow detail. If you go from 400 to 200 to 100, 2 stops more light into your shadow detail. And just the opposite. If you take your Tri-X film and instead of 400, you expose it at 800, it's going to let in less detail into your shadows. And there's reasons, aesthetic reasons, why you might want to do that. I mentioned as we go from the world of normal development, you can develop your film in different ways. and though they're not considered right for normal exposure, they could be correct for your particular ASA that you're using. So for example, you can, if you overdevelop your film, this is going to give you more contrast. It will build up the whites, build up the middle tones. It leaves the blacks about the same. But then you have more density in your middle tones and in your whites. And when you look at the negative, it looks like it has more contrast. And indeed, it will have more contrast when you make the print, but it'll also have a little more grain. So if you plan on experimenting with your film, as I mentioned at the very end, using 100 film, ASA 100, would be better for overdevelopment. Now the other development technique is to underdevelop your film. And if you underdevelop your film, you're going to get less contrast. If you get less contrast, again, your blacks build up to a certain point, your mid-tones are well recorded, your whites are well recorded, but when you underdevelop, the whites don't get as dense, so that when you make your print, your blacks, your middle tones, and your whites are more equalized. So it gives an appearance of less contrast. The other advantage, you get less grain. So if you have 400 film, expose it at 200 or 100, underdevelop your film, you'll have a print eventually that will have a little less grain. So now I'm looking at a little handout that one of those books from the 60s and 70s and 80s when photography was very popular. I think this is by Upton and Upton, or maybe London and Upton, and it shows us a page. And we're looking at a series of exposures and developments. And you'll see that the face is cut in half. On the left-hand side is the negative, the way the negative looks. And on the right-hand side is the way that the face looks when it's printed. So I put a little red mark around the middle normal exposure, normal development. And one of my first interests in trying different exposures and different development times is the overexposure and the underdevelopment. Why? Because it more matched what my eyes saw. So I liked the idea of that Edward Weston picture of the old toilet, and I liked the idea of what Cartier-Bresson was doing. So that was one of my first areas of exploration. And here's some examples. I set up my camera with my father in the scene, and he was reading a book. I set up the camera, it was in the winter time, and I made a series of exposures. The first exposure, as you see here, is when I exposed for the outdoors. I shot it at about f/16, and then I developed the film normally. Now the outside looks good, but as you can see, f/16 for the interior is way underexposed. So he's practically, there's no detail on the negative. And then I took another picture, and here I opened the lens several stops to f/4. Now here, the inside looks good. You can see him, you can see the detail on the wall, you can see the paintings. But the outside is completely dense. It's pure white. So that would be a tough one to print. You'd have to hold the inside, have to burn the windows like crazy. And the previous one would be hard to print, maybe even harder, because to hold back my father in the shadows, it would look terrible. So how about a compromise? In between f/16 and f/4, here's f/8. And it's a compromise. You see a little more detail in the shadow detail. You see the window is still blocked up, quite a bit. And these are all three of these negatives were normally developed. Even the compromise was a tough one. This is a tough one because it was such a big contrast range. On this last negative that we're looking at, I could dodge him in the inside a little bit, and I could burn the outside, but I'd be doing a lot of hijinks in the darkroom. So the idea of this is to take a picture, expose it, and develop it so that it's easy to make a print in the darkroom. So I went back to my original exposure of the interior, favors the interior, f/4, and instead of developing the film normally, I cut the development in half. Just like that. And by cutting it, say from, I'll just say as 10 minutes, I go 5 minutes. And the negative looks like this. We see here now details in the shadows that can still be dodged a little. details out the window that can still be burned in a little, but it'll be so easy, so effortless to make a good print in the darkroom. And as you're testing your films under developing, which is coupled with overexposure, you'll find that half the normal development time is about as far as you want to go. Anything after that, it gets to be a little spooky. Now here are several examples that I took throughout the years. This first one is a photograph done in the winter. And my wife and the family were all indoors early in the morning, having great pancakes and hot coffee and eggs. And I took my camera, went outdoors after a great snowstorm. And the photograph here of the Volkswagen covered with snow and the barn represent an exposure based upon the interior, where you can see it gave enough exposure for the Volkswagen. And then the development was cut almost in half, so that you could still see the detail of the barn. And I still have to dodge the inside a little bit, burn in the barn in the background to make a nice print. You know, this overexposure under development is also great for nighttime photography. That's almost a separate topic. But here's an image here from the old days, and it's called the White Castle. And it was taken in the about 80s, early 80s. In fact, they're advertising Camel cigarettes, but I don't think they do that anymore. And the traffic is going by, so it's several seconds long to achieve this, and it makes a really nice print. There's plenty of details in the cars that are parking, and it's just an easy negative to print because of the exposure. Plenty of detail comes onto the negative, and then under development by about a half. The use of overexposure under development is very effective for your interior shots. So I like to go to abandoned grain elevators and places that are being torn down and sneak in under the barbed wire and all that, and go snooping around. And so this was near the University of Minnesota, and it's a grain elevator now gone. But as I crawled in and found this scene, I thought, oh, this is lovely. These big windows, these big lights, coming in, and the great machine there that took the grain in. And so, the good example of overexposure, cut the development by half to get a pretty easy print. I got to burn in the windows just a little bit. So if we go back to our chart and look at the exposure guide, you'll see that the red indicates overexposure and underdevelopment. And if you compare it to the rest of the little squares, you'll see it has a flat look to it. It's flat. And indeed, when you have extreme contrast range, that's what you want. You want a flat negative. Now, let's flip the coin and go to the other side. Going back to our chart here, when we underexpose, do not let in as much detail, and overdevelop, we still get a nice printable negative. The result is your shadows, your blacks are more intense, but you still have good detail in your whites. And here's some photographers and some different views, and you'll realize that it presents a different aesthetic approach. When we add time to our development, instead of developing 10 minutes, we develop 12 minutes or 15 minutes or even 20 minutes. When we do that, then to make the negative more normal, we have to give less than normal exposure. So that means our tri-X would be more like, instead of 400, maybe go 600, or that's a half stop, or 800, that's a full stop, maybe 1200 or 1600. And when you do that, you'll balance out your negative, but a slight downside is when you increase your development times, then you'll be getting a little more grain. So a slower film is maybe better for this. Or if you got large format like 2 1/4, 4x5, doesn't make any difference. We got 35 millimeter, might want to use like T-Max 100 or Ilford's Delta 100. Increase the development time, and you won't notice the grain as much. And here's just a quick example, and where I shot the same subject, and I took 2 pictures of a little bunny rabbit that had been run over in the street, and then developed it normally. And then I took 2 pictures of the same bunny rabbit, which didn't move, and then I overdeveloped it. Sorry, I got to say that over again. So here's an example, and it's actually based on a photograph by Frederick Somers that nobody ever heard of. But Frederick Somers did this, he was active back in the 30s and 40s and 50s. And here's the image by Frederick Somers. When I saw this little bunny rabbit in the street, I thought, oh, this would be kind of cute. It would kind of remind me of Frederick Somers. So we have actually, it looks like 4 pictures, but each one is a 4x5. And I shot 2 of the bunny and then developed normally. I shot 2 of the bunny underexposed and then overdeveloped. And as you can see, the ones on the left kind of look normal, but the ones on the right have a more of a graphic feel. The graphic feel is part of the aesthetics of underexposure, overdevelopment. You're not going to use this technique to photograph your grandma. No, sir. You want to do the other one where you overexpose and underdevelop. That takes out her wrinkles anyway. So what you want to do is keep in mind the photographers that have embraced this idea of slight underexposure with overdevelopment have tended to be a little more graphic in their output. And here's some photographers that always inspired me. One is my own father, Frank Agar. He made this photograph in 1950. It's called William Forbes. We called it the junk man for many years, but then that became politically incorrect. Now it's called William Forbes, which was his real name. He was a sanitation engineer. And it has kind of a nitty-gritty, because he was unshaven and kind of had a little dirt on his face, has a sense of graphic quality to it. The good, strong blacks, good, strong whites. My father's teacher, Minor White, made very effective use of underexposure, overdevelopment, as in this fantasy scene. It's just called a wall incrustations. But when he got up close, removed the environment of the wall, what are we looking at? Well, it goes on to another level. That's part of the aesthetics. It looks like the moonrise coming over a little waterfall or something like that. To me, that's what it looks like. Minor White. So he made very good use of underexposure, overdevelopment. Another photographer that really inspired me for this type of aesthetic technique was the son of Edward Weston. Now, Edward Weston grew up in the late 19th century, early 20th century, so his first use of photography was platinum printing, which platinum printing is pretty flat and a little dark side if we look at it today. Very beautiful, though. Now, Brett Weston, his son, he had 2 sons. Cole Weston did color, and Brett Weston, who was a really good photographer, Brett Weston used silver gelatin right from the beginning. So his photographs tended to be rather snappy, and he went on a slightly more abstract side, as you can see in this photograph from the white sands of New Mexico. You know, you're looking at these sand dunes, and the blacks and the midtones are very, very dramatic. Here's another one by Brett Weston, who lived as his dad did in Carmel, California, near Point Lobos, and he'd go down to the beach, take pictures, tide pools and things like that. And so when you look at this picture, there's a tide pool at Point Lobos, you realize you don't have any beautiful sunsets or anything like that, and little seals looking at you with cute eyes. What you're looking at is something a little more abstract, graphic, and terse. So, that's the way Brett Weston photographed. He was always on the cutting edge of being just a little too extreme, but always elegantly restrained, not going over that edge. So his prints are always quite a bit of fun to look at. But the final photographer who I associate with Midwest, the Chicago area, is Aaron Siskind. And he made a career out of photographing billboards and stuff like that, and he'd bring out the graphic qualities. And this image that you're looking at is called Kentucky. And he traveled all around the world, Mexico, Europe, and all that. And his photographs all kind of look the same, so that you don't know if he was in Kentucky or Mexico or Ireland or someplace like that. Here's a photograph of mine that kind of uses that idea of underexposure and then overdevelopment. So it was the end of the summer. The sunflowers had all decayed and died and had fallen down. So I just got up close to this one sunflower and made an arrangement, underexposed slightly, and then overdeveloped the film to bring out more contrast. So it prints up very nicely on just regular, normal contrast grade paper. As a conclusion now, combinations that I've covered that are easily accessible to you would be Tri-X film that you can rate at a lower ASA starting from 400, 200, 150. The beauty about this, by the way, if you're using roll film, you can take one picture after another at different ASAs, then you're going to couple it with underdevelopment. And it depends on what your subject is and how much you want, how extreme you want to make this. But minus 25%, minus 30%, minus 50%, that'd be half normal, can give you a different range of underexposure to balance out your overexposure. Then the other combination is using a slower film like maybe T-Max 100, and for that you can rate it, instead of 100, rate it at 200 or 400 or 800, and then add to your development 25%, 50%, double the development, go instead of 10 minutes, go 20 minutes, and then you can take it more extreme if you wish. So this is a little bit on the, again, following up my philosophy of guerrilla photography, because we're not getting into the more complex understanding of shadow, highlight, contrast range that would be covered in the zone system. And I bet there's a lot of videos out there on the zone system, a little more complex. But I have some ideas for you on experimentation if you're interested, and here they are. First one, basic to what we've been talking about today, is to use different ASAs for your film, experimenting with different development times. The next one is what would happen if you change the dilutions of your developer. And a good example, when I was a kid, you know, using Tri-X sheet film, HC110, I was using 1:7, I was developing about 4.5 minutes. And then Ansel Adams came out with his book on development times, and he suggested a dilution of, instead of HC110 at 1:7, a 1:15. And then instead of 4.5 minutes, I go about 9 minutes for my normal development. The nice thing about the 9 minutes is if you need to underdevelop your film, you can cut back to 6 minutes, easy, instead of developing normally 1:7 with your HC110 and going from 4.5 minutes, I don't know, 3 minutes. That's too short. You need to develop it for a while. So by diluting your developer, you can extend your development times. Then you can cut back for your less than normal, even going up to 1/2 normal. So that, and then the opposite. Instead of D76 1:1, which is what many people use, go D76 straight and develop your film. Then you're going to get more contrast faster, so you're not sitting in the darkroom missing all those important tweets. Then there's another one, and that is to change the development temperature. Use hotter temperatures for more contrast, lower temperatures for extended times, and then less development. And then finally, there's a new one out that I actually tried. I think it looks pretty good, and that's called standalone development. And for that, you have a very dilute developer. You agitate your film, let it sit for 1 hour. You know, go upstairs, make coffee, do the dishes, take care of the dog, vacuum, blah, blah, blah. Oh, your alarm little tweets go off. Down you go, and then take the film out, and you'll find that it looks pretty good from my initial experiments. Anyway, kids, that's all for today. And hope to hear from you and see what you think about this lecture, see what you have acquired. And if you have any questions, you can forward it to the very attractive and mysterious Ms. Laura Sargent, producer, videographer, the editor, who answers all your emails. Bye-bye.